We are live. Good evening, everyone out there online. This is Talking Jazz webinar series of the Jazz Journalists Association, sponsored by Jazz Cruise Entertainment Cruise Productions via its Anita E. Berry Jazz Education Fund. I'm Howard Mandel, president of the Jazz Journalists Association, and tonight we're talking about jazz education, jazz academics, and jazz journalists. What are the distinctions in our perspectives as they show up in our professional work? And what are our points of convergence, conjunction, and possible collaboration? We have a very distinguished panel. Dr. Monika Herzig, who's the senior lecturer in arts at Indiana University, and also secretary of the Jazz Education Network. She's just back from the GEN conference. Dr. Larry Ridley, who's executive director of the African American Jazz Caucus. He's a renowned bassist and a professor of music emeritus of Livingston College of Rutgers University, where he taught from 1971 to 1999 when he retired. He is still working at Manhattan School of Music and also Swing University, the educational program of Jazz at Lincoln Center. Also, Alex Rodriguez, who's an improvising trombonist, a PhD student in ethnomusicology at UCLA, and Alex has written for the Newark Star-Ledger, National Public Radio's A Blog Supreme, the LA Weekly, and he keeps his own blog, Lubricity. Neil Tesser, old friend of mine, colleague, 2014 Grammy Award winner for liner note writing. Neil has been a jazz journalist, columnist, broadcaster for more than 40 years, and he's also been an adjunct at Northwestern University and University of Illinois, Chicago. I'll also mention, to establish my own bona fides, that besides writing and reporting about jazz for a number of platforms, I've been an adjunct professor at New York University's School of Continuing and Professional Studies for 28 years. So, hi everybody, and starting with Monika, please say hello, and if you can, succinctly characterize the relationships, as you see them, between jazz academy, education, and journalism. Monika?
I'm Monika Herzig, and besides doing the work in arts administration here, I also went into the scholarly work, and for the Jazz Education Network group, I'm overseeing the Jazz Research Committee. So recently we've done quite a bit of surveying, actually, into what the jazz researchers do, and realizing that this is a extremely wide field, and the connection here between the jazz journalists and the jazz researchers is really strong, because the jazz researchers depend on the journalists to bring them a lot of the live and current information that helps them go deeper and get the facts on the table. So I would say the relationship is quite a dependent one, and nurturing each other, if that's a good start.
It is a good start. And let's ask Larry, what do you think?
Well, I've long been involved as a performer and as an academician, and also interaction with a number of the great writers of jazz like Dan Morgenstern, Ed Berger, and Leonard Feather, on and on. I could name a bunch of names through the years. I've been out here quite a few years now, and I've had nothing but good relationships with all of the people that I've had the pleasure of interacting with.
Good. Alex?
Hi, I'm Alex, and I guess my take on this is that for me, they've always been overlapping in my own professional work. I started graduate school in the Rutgers Jazz History and Research program in 2009, and started my blog shortly thereafter, which got me connected with opportunities in journalism. And I think in part it's because anthropology and ethnomusicology are both big parts of how I relate to academia, is that I'm seeing how the things that I learned as a journalist really inform that, because at the end of the day we're interested in what people are doing now, so in that sense, I feel like there's a particular resonance with work in anthropology and ethnomusicology that has had important resonances with journalists, and in fact, a lot of journalists who have worked in those with those methodologies, and also anthropologists and ethnomusicologists who have had used strong relationships with journalists to form the entry point for their work. So I've seen in my own career so far how mutually informing they are. Do more with who you're hanging out with, and what kinds of writing you're expected to do at the end of the day. I've noticed that has been very different, whether or not I'm writing for a newspaper or trying to frame something for a conference paper or an academic journal, are very different kinds of writing, even though ultimately what I'm trying to get at are similar truths.
Neil, what's your take on this?
I agree. There's a great overlap, but it's not a complete congruency. It's more like a Venn diagram, and on either sides of those intersecting circles, you have people who are involved with very different sorts of needs and goals. On the one hand, you have many journalists who are really not concerned with what's going on from a historical or research basis. On the other hand, you have many researchers who I have found through following conversations on the Jazz Research List group, which is a closed group of jazz researchers and some journalists. And many of those people have relatively little interest, and in some cases a surprising lack of knowledge of what is going on today. I don't mean that in a pejorative sense. I simply mean that they're not focused on that. And I mention that as an indication of the fact that a good part of the jazz research community is focused on things that are not happening today. So I think while we concentrate on where the commonalities lie, it's important to note that that is, as I said, a portion of the where the Venn diagram comes together, and that there are people on both sides who really have relatively little to do with the concerns of the other.
Well, is that in large part because of different demands on journalists and on scholars within their own professions, do you think?
I think it's different demands, and I think it's different areas of interest. Alex, I think, is somewhat unusual. He's not alone. There are other people that we can name who I consider very excellent researchers and completely engaged in the demands and rigors of academia, who are also doing what I think of journalists as doing, which is covering and reporting what's happening at the moment. But so I think there are some people who do that, but in many cases it's not just demands, it's the choice. Some people prefer to take the long view and spend a good deal of time researching, getting into some very fine points of music that may be 30 or 50 or 80 years old. Some people prefer to be, as it were, on the fly and really sort of, actually on the scene and reporting on what's happening at that moment.
Monika, let me ask you, you had presented a diagram to me of the results of a survey that you've done. Can you talk a little bit about that?
What we did, we tried to figure out or map that whole jazz research area. How does it look like? Where are people active? What do people do these days? And something that we realized is that jazz research has a lot of different categories. Many, from psychological, sociological, historical aspects to hearing, to improvisation, to pedagogy things. So we looked at that, and it turns out, well, probably somewhat expected in terms of frequency, where people are active in which areas, that obviously the musicology, the historical, and the cultural aspects are far ahead from all the other buckets. So it kind of confirms what we suspect, that a lot of the research looks at the past, while journalism is there to look at what's going on presently and how can we move the present forward. And journalism is there, well, it has to, because it has to be sustainable has to find an audience and has to get rewarded for their writings. While in academia, often you have the luxury of saying, well, I'm getting paid by a university, but my work is writing these things, reporting back to them, so the reward is keeping your job.
I'd like to add something, Howard, if you don't mind.
Sure.
Along those lines, I feel like another piece in my experience of just working with jazz journalists and the people that I've met through the Jazz Journalists Association, people like Howard and Neil, and I don't know, David Adler is another one who I was close with when I was in New York. But they're all people who are you know, walking founts of oral history too. You know, so you know, that the idea that the journalist isn't a historian is I don't know. I certainly have gotten a lot out of the conversations I've had with people who have just been on the beat for a while. That's its own kind of history making, and you know, a lot of the best you know, best jazz scholarship takes advantage of that, and it's those kinds of relationships that really make it go.
Larry, I wanted to ask you something, and preceded by pointing out that there are many different aspects of jazz education or jazz scholarship, jazz academy, the Jazz Academy that we're talking about here. And I mean, Monika was just talking about researchers. Larry, you set up a BA program at Livingston that was in jazz performance, so it's more of teaching of instrumental skills and that sort of thing, is it not?
Yeah, it was that, but it was also a historical component as well. I taught a course for several years that was called The Evolution of Jazz, and it was a year course and divided up talking about the early origins and beginnings and the sources, like coming from Africa and on up to the present day, but it stretched it out over a year's course offering. So the students that would go from the first year to, that was like the primer for them to continue going on and to show the kind of aspects of what happened in the music, how the music evolved, and to stress the artistic component with the different originators of the music and developing their own styles and talking about that, so that people got out of the notion that possibly there was a cookie cutter approach to learning how to play jazz. But my whole thing has always been about finding your own voice and understanding that and building on that, because one of the things I have problem with sometimes with some of the academic programs is that you know, they focus on giving people the idea of playing the Lydiot scales, and that's your sentence structure for developing your solos and finding your own voice, and that's only a very small part of it. You know, like there's so much that is involved in it. You know, the sociological aspects, the and also the musical aspects of learning jazz theory, or you know, and learning your instrument and listening to others who are the recognized people who have set their styles as being a part of the standards of the music, and striving for some sort of amalgam of all of that by the students, hopefully.
Did you feel the students were attentive to, outside the classroom, to what was going on in the jazz world at the time? I mean, I would, when I was teaching, I would assign my students to watch coverage of jazz in the New York Times or in the New York City Jazz Record, or even the little squibs in the front of the New Yorker, to be sure that they knew what was going on in the scene. Is that something that you would do, to try to point your students to be aware of what was happening, or is that something that jazz educators do in general now?
Yes, that was a very primary part of it, because for them to get out and hear the masters and to understand and get more involved with listening to their stylistic approach to the music, and even establishing some sort of camaraderie with them in order to get to know what makes this individual tick. You know, like Sonny Rollins versus John Coltrane. You know, I had the pleasure of playing with all these people, and so knowing that how they approach their styles and their improvisational concepts was very important. And I think that that's an important part of any student of the music wanting to become a performer, that they have to understand this, because, you know, the polls, I think, sometimes give a sort of a problem with in the minds of certain students, because I go out and do a lot of these workshops, and the first thing I ask students, well, what are you aspiring to do? And some of them say, well, you know, I want to get out there and I want to get some gigs and I want to make my own CD. I said, you know, and what? I mean, that's a little short-sighted, you know. You know, because what are you offering? I mean, it's just like, you know, if you're selling sugar and you come up with a different brand other than Domino, you better make sure that that sugar is competitive with Domino sugar. You know what I mean?
Well, can they get some of that information about the stylizations, about the import, about the context from journalism, or do you think that they're better to get that from researchers or scholars who are within the academy?
Well, I think it's a balance between all, because I think the jazz writers and researchers have a particular direction of what they offer to someone who wants to truly be knowledgeable about the music. I mean, you got to know where the music came from, and you have to hear people who are offering a sort of a critique of what has happened in the evolution of the music. And if they don't know that, I mean, you don't have to have a hole in your head to have an open mind.
Nicely put.
That
I
reminds
want to
me.
mention also that we will be taking comments, and I will introduce them into the conversation at appropriate moments, and especially during the last half hour of the conversation. But to the attendees of the webinar, if you do have things that you'd like me to bring into the conversation, please type them in, and we will be talking about those things down the line a little bit. I'm sorry, Alex, were you about to jump in there?
I just wanted to add something to that, and that was that I think this is something that I think a lot of, it's sort of a sense I've been picking up on in various places from people who are engaged in academic circles and have experience as performers. I'm thinking of people like David Ake and Vijay Iyer, who have, I've seen each of those two, for example, say things to the effect of how important it is to be thinking through history as you go, or something that Wayne Shorter told me in a recent interview. He said you have to have a lot of historical data to be able to get to the future, and
Exactly.
Thinking about how these institutions can be constructed to take advantage of engaged in these schools is a tremendous resource for students and undergraduates, and that gets them out of that, like, yeah, I want to make a record and get some gigs kind of mentality.
Well, I think the question is whether this kind of commonality is seen mostly in retrospect, and that the teachers in jazz education are able to pick up on what the journalists have said 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, 40 years down the line, which seemed to be what Neil was suggesting from the Jazz Research Group, where a lot of the comments are about fairly specialized details of things that happened in the 30s or 40s.
We probably have to distinguish between education and research, because those themselves have different goals,
Yeah.
as has been coming out in the conversation here. But to what you were saying earlier about asking your students to be up on what's going on, I think that most people who come into a college course looking to know more about jazz, whether it's just as a casual fan or as someone who's going to make a career of it, are backing their way in anyway. They're hearing things that they like now and then going back to determine the history that led to that. You know, the famous example of how you hear Kind of Blue, and then you go back and you hear Cannonball Adderley, and then you hear who played with Cannonball Adderley, and played who with him, and the same with Coltrane. And so you back in through something you're hearing now. I think for many students, the ones that I taught most recently, a lot of them were getting to the music via, for instance, Robert Glasper, and starting to research the jazz elements of what he was doing when they were available. Of course, one of the students also wanted to do a paper on Elvis Presley, so you can't always, you can't always trust them. But anyway, you do find that people are working their way in, as I say, kind of working back. So I think it's very valuable to encourage them to be aware of what's going on right now. I mean, that's the contemporary music that people are that's going to grab their ear.
I've actually just started this very experiment with this. I'm TAing the jazz history and American culture class here at UCLA this quarter, and I have 28 students, and their first writing assignment, I invited them to, as creatively as they wanted to, connect what they were learning about this concept of what was going on in early jazz, swing and improvisation, and the historical circumstances of it, and the blues, and pick anything and connect it to that in some way. And the connections that they're making have been really interesting. And I'm learning a lot about contemporary pop music. I mean, it's Katy Perry and Jay-Z but the connections are there and they're real, and so those are the things that I get excited about, certainly when I get to be in contact with this, just the contemporary genre.
We're suffering a little bit of freeze on your visual and audio, Alex, but I think we can work around it. I've got a question from, which takes us a little different direction, from Howard Fisher. He says, jazz educators need the help of jazz journalists mainly to help raise funds for activities needed to educate students. That relationship must be enhanced. I'd like to hear ideas on how to better accomplish this. This is a little bit of a divergence from what we've been talking about, but I'll just raise that right now.
Can I say something to that? I would venture, based on my experience, that the flows of money are precisely the opposite. That educational institutions, have a lot more support for capital J jazz initiatives than mainstream popular contemporary institutions. It's a lot easier to get a job, as an adjunct lecturer for a jazz history course at a college or something like that than make a living as a jazz journalist covering the beat these days. Whereas that probably wasn't true 30 or 40 years ago. And I think about some of the biggest movers and shakers in terms of having access to financial resources in the jazz economy today are making their money from educational initiatives like Jazz at Lincoln Center, Swing University, that sort of thing. It's like, that's where the money's at.
I want to say something in that direction if I can, Alex. So I think there's a misconception on the question that he's asking. I think it's more about the role that the journalists are supposed to play. They're supposed to, I guess, advertise or promote a school or what they're doing so they get more support and look better. And I think here's a issue with thinking, what is the role of the jazz journalist? The jazz musicians often assume they just serve their purposes. They're supposed to groom them and help them out. And if they're not, and not about the criticism part. So I sense a little bit of that discrepancy in that comment. Okay, a journalist is just supposed to serve me and help me out to make sure my stuff gets promoted and I get the support I need. Am I right in that direction?
Yeah, I think a lot of people do feel that way. Yeah, and
yeah.
I think to some extent that is part of the journalist's job, is to promote via education. By which I mean, I don't think a review is much good if it simply says go hear this or don't go hear this. I think it's valuable if it tells you something more about how to listen, and what you might listen for so that the listener can go and decide for himself. And in that sense, in the terms of promoting the music, I think maybe for me a better description would be promoting the experience of hearing the music and allowing people to decide for themselves how much they want to be educated, how much they want to learn about what's good and what may not be as good. So I think there's always, and always has been, an element of promotion in arts journalism of any kind. I mean, even if you're simply being a hard-nosed critic, a rave review is going to be used to promote. But Monika is talking about something else, which is the feeling that this is the only thing that a journalist should be doing, and that's problematic because I think a number of people do believe that.
I want to bring up one example, though, of one of our colleagues, Paul DeBarros, who did find that there were ways to cover jazz education that were occurring in the Seattle area where he works, and he was writing about high school jazz bands which were in local competitions, and there are several of them in the Seattle area that advanced the essentially Ellington program that Jazz and Lincoln Center does. He was writing about these competitions as if they were high school sports, and he found that that actually drew a lot of readers to his columns in the local newspaper. And I think that that was really a brilliant technique and tactic for raising the profile of local jazz education, involving students and their friends and their families in reading him, and it was good all the way around, I thought.
I have to say I was a product of that scene. I grew up in Portland, Oregon, and very jealous of everything that was happening in Seattle, and I would see that development, and it's worth noting that the people like Paul DeBarros were an important part of promoting the of 15 years. It absolutely bears out like what has been historically significant in terms of just who's been playing jazz in the Pacific Northwest, and it's all about those high school programs and that kind of model.
Well, we have a comment from Steve P. It says most jazz journalists are actually unpaid bloggers, and I would say that that's not exactly true, and although certainly bloggers can be journalists, journalists aren't necessarily bloggers, and what we're talking about it should be relevant to bloggers also. It doesn't mean that you abandon journalistic principles, professional principles. So I think that this bridges both the unpaid and the professional paid journalists, the discussion we're trying to have.
And I think it bears adding also that the institution of journalism as a professional, financially supported endeavor is completely upside down right now. I mean, no one knows what's going on, and it's crazy. And the money is nowhere near what it was, just structurally. That has fundamentally changed in the last 10, 15 years. And so it's all the more important that we are having these conversations and understanding what kinds of knowledge has been produced by people in that profession over the last few decades, and making sure that that stays in the mix, even if there aren't steady gigs covering the beat in the way that there were a generation ago.
Yeah, to Alex's point, I've probably now reached the point where I don't expect to get paid for regular daily or several times a week coverage of music in Chicago. And having worked for various sites where I got paid next to nothing, I've decided that if I'm going to do that, I might as well have complete control over it. So I'm going to be starting my own blog, which will be less of a blog than a series of journalistic articles, pretty much the way, Howard, you work with the Arts Journal, and the way I imagine our friend Doug Rainey works, not Doug Rainey, Doug, who am I thinking of? Sorry?
Doug Ramsey.
Yeah, Doug Ramsey, sorry. And his excellent column, Riptides. I'm sure that's how Mark Meyer started his column, which has become successful. I think he's managed to monetize it to some extent. But this, as Alex said, it's upside down. He hasn't managed to monetize it. All right. Well, Howard,
I got $50 from an SEO marketer once, and I've had my blog for 5 years.
Yeah. So I mean, so these things are it really now is becoming more of a labor of love, to Alex's point, because the money has become almost non-existent. And it's not that the people who are paying less. They may not be paying more, but they're not paying less than they were. It's just that there are so many fewer opportunities. Newspapers are smaller. Magazines don't have as much room, and so there are less assignments, fewer assignments. And and a completely separate discussion here is probably the fact that the web and digitalization, which is allowing us to have this entire conversation for people to witness, has not shaken out yet, has really changed things in a dramatic way. If everybody can self-publish and nobody needs an editor, then everybody's a journalist. And if everybody's a journalist, it's really hard to tell who the good ones are, because that's hard for them to poke through all of the garbage. And there's a lot of garbage out there. And every musician, including those who are getting great reviews from, quote, journalists, unquote, bloggers, will tell you the writing has become abysmal for the most part.
Well, let me ask then Monika and Larry also, are the people who are veterans or scholars in the jazz world concerned that journalism is pressured with these financial constraints and that the quality is perhaps getting watered down?
Well, here's actually what's going on. The print industry is just going the same path as the music industry, just following a few years after. Meaning, when the internet hit and the music industry was turned upside down in terms of not selling product anymore and everything going to live performance and trying to find a new model to become sustainable, which by now becomes the model of that direct artist-fan relations. Meaning, you have to just accumulate a certain number of people who enjoy what you do and stay in close contact and figure out a way how to monetize that relationship. So just a few years later, the same thing happened to the print industry, right? And the borders go out of stock and nobody buys books anymore, and nobody buys papers because you can get it all online. So now the journalists are in the same positions as the musician, that it's not a sustainable living, so how can we do that? And I guess the blogging idea is the same idea with the artist-fan relationship, where you just find new business models on how to create those relationships for people that say, I really like what this person has to say all the time. I'm going to follow this, and if I like it, I'm willing to, support in many ways. So, that I just wanted to mention that in that term of relationship and getting paid. It's a sign of the times, and all those industries just have to merge into those new models, and it's very difficult.
Well, of course, but what I'm saying is, will you be at a loss for having information in 20 years about what happened in 2013, 2014, because, there's no dependable journalism to draw on. And Larry, as a veteran performer, are you concerned that, there aren't reviews for yourself or for your students that provide the buzz that has always sustained, information dissemination, opinion dissemination, so that there's something to talk about? And it's happening in radio also.
You're right. Well, the arena is changing. It has changed. All the things that have mentioned, Monika hit on several of the things, because people have blogs and they're using YouTube, and there's also this live stream. So there are a variety of things. But again, I think it's going to take people thinking and redefining the way that they're going to go about presenting themselves, because there's so much money out there promoting commercial music that it's a different ball game. Not that it wasn't all along, but I mean, now with all the advent of the electronics and what we're doing here, we're able to communicate and carry on a conversation to discuss and try to come up with some of our ideas, and hopefully each of us will take it and synthesize and come up with new ways. But I think the matter of us keeping in touch with each other, you know, I think that one of the things that happened a lot was sort of a degree of alienation between performers and the people who write. You know, that's always been a situation. You know, I've through the years, I remember hearing quite a few named musicians say, "Oh man, this person is full of you know what, that's writing. They don't know anything about what's happening, and they have their favorites." And you know, it's a very complex kind of thing. But I think that there's an adjustment that we're all attempting to make now with these new dimensions, like what we're doing now, and talking with each other over the internet. You know, we don't have to be in the same room or wait for the particular get together like the International Association of Jazz Educators or now GEN, you know, what they're doing. I mean, it's nice for all of us to come together at a certain point to sort of share ideas, but I think that there's got to be an ongoing dialogue going out to the public. And you know, we're suffering the same thing that what soap is going through. Everything is going through a different way of putting a product out there to the marketplace and let the buyer beware.
To your comment, Howard, about how this is going to affect researchers, I do think that, and Alex, I'd like to hear your view on this, but I do think that 10, 15 years from now, researchers are going to be somewhat hobbled, not by the lack of volume of material out there, but by the quality of it, and by, more than that, the confidence in it. I mean, I recently wrote a story about a musician, and he in the course of our conversation, we talked about many things. My editor at the magazine that I was working for had read several other interviews with him and said, "Well, what about this? He said this to this other interviewer. That's a great story." And I asked him about that. I said, "Well, all right, we can include it if you want." And he said, "Well, no, they took me completely wrong. I was kidding." And the interviewer was completely inexperienced, and she thought I was serious, so she wrote this thing, this quote fact, that is not a fact.